Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this recorded training on demystifying community level prevention. My name's Jessie Spinney. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the prevention coordinator here at the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Today, we're going to talk about everything community level prevention, the ins and outs of it. What does it entail? What does it look like? How is it different maybe from individual and relationship level prevention? How can you incorporate community level prevention programming within your community? But more than anything, as it says in the title, we really want to demystify community level prevention. Sometimes this level of prevention can feel a little nebulous. It can feel a little vague. It can be hard to kind of nail down what community level prevention is. And so our goal by the end of this is that you're going to feel a little bit more grounded in understanding what community level prevention is, and also ideally have some ideas for how you can implement community level programming within your prevention work. So we first want to orient ourselves in a quick kind of violence prevention overview. Many of you are already going to be familiar with these topics and concepts, but it is helpful for us to kind of ground ourselves within that. So we obviously know that when we talk about violence prevention work, we're talking about addressing the root causes of violence, right? And we do that through identifying things like risk and protective factors, or the conditions that either prevent violence from happening or increase the likelihood of it happening, right? We do this through organizing within our community to identify what we want to work on, right? And a lot of times that has happened at the individual or relationship level of what we call the social ecological model, right? Which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a second. But we identify within our communities, these are things that we want to work on when it comes to addressing the root causes of violence, right? And we also know that doing that needs to be really informed by the community, but also really informed in anti-oppression practices, really informed within an intersectional approach, recognizing that the root causes of violence are systems of oppression, right? The root causes of violence are white supremacist systems, heteropatriarchal systems, homophobia, transphobia, classism, all of these systems of supremacy that create hierarchies of how we value different humans, right? That's why we have such a huge problem with domestic violence and sexual assault, interpersonal violence within our communities, right? It stems from those larger scale systems of oppression. And so when we talk about violence prevention, we're not only talking about things like identifying risk and protective factors that we want to address within our community. We're also talking about doing that in a way that, again, is really holistic, really grounded in what the community needs, but is also really mindful of also working towards the liberation, safety, and ability for all communities to thrive is what it really comes down to, right? And so, as I mentioned, we often talk about the social ecological model within prevention work, right? Where we have individual, relationship, community, and societal levels within the social ecological model. And for many of us, the work that we do within prevention work is really focused on those individual and relationship levels. So that individual level is our attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, the things that we kind of think and feel when we think about interpersonal relationships, right? The things that we view as normal or abnormal within those relationships. It's kind of our sense of self as well. The relationship level is our peer-to-peer or partner-to-partner, community member to community member dynamics, right? It's how we show up in relationship with other people. And that is obviously going to be informed by the individual level, which is why oftentimes a lot of prevention programming involves both of these levels. This is predominantly the case in school-based healthy relationships curriculum that many of us have experience implementing, right? that's really addressing that individual and relationship level because it's impacting folks' attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, and then the way that they interact in relationships, right? The individual and relationship level will and always will be, right, incredibly important within prevention work, right? You can't get to the societal and community level unless you are also engaging in those other levels as well. But as you can see, the way that the social ecological model is organized, it's like nesting dolls, right? They build off of each other. And so similarly to individual, building up into relationship, individual and relationship build up to community, right? So when we think about community level prevention, we can kind of think about it from the perspective of scaling up our prevention work, right? Through addressing the risk and protective factors at the individual and relationship level, while also looking at those risk and protective factors at the community level as well to scale up the work that we're doing. And that's what we're going to talk about next. How can we take the work that we're already doing within our communities at the individual and relationship level and scale it up to addressing the community level as well? So we've talked a little bit so far about community level prevention, but I do think it's important for us to define that, right? What does that mean? So community level prevention, the definition that I want to offer up to this space is that it focuses on policies, practices, and/or norms that protect against interpersonal violence within a specific community through collaboration and mobilization, right? So it's really getting at the way a specific community operates and works through its policies, practices, and norms, right? The goal is that you're focusing on uplifting policies, practices, and norms that protect against interpersonal violence, but you're doing that through collaboration and mobilization. It's one of the biggest key features of community level prevention. It needs to be done with a high level of community involvement, which we're going to talk about in a little bit as well. But first and foremost, what is a community, right? I'm sure anyone that watches this recording is going to have their own definition. And a lot of the definitions are probably going to be really, really similar. But there's probably also going to be some variance there, right? And that's because a community means a lot of different things, right? And this quote that I have here by Dr. Renee Branch Kennedy, I think really kind of encapsulates how nuanced a community could be. So Dr. Renee Branch Kennedy says, a community is defined more by relationship than radius, more by values than locale, and more by affinities than vicinities, right? So community doesn't necessarily have to be a neighborhood, right? A neighborhood is geographically organized, right? A community doesn't necessarily need to be a school, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be a workplace. A community could be a after-school boxing program for youth. A community could be a book club, right? A community could be, it could be folks getting together once a month at a local park to share resources, right? And it could also be a neighborhood, a school, a workplace. It is essentially just any organization of people that are connected by something, right? When we view community in this more holistic, kind of wide-ranging, flexible way, it really does open up multiple possibilities for us when it comes to doing community level prevention. This is something that I encourage folks to kind of think about throughout the rest of the content today. Start thinking about the communities that first come to your mind within your service area, right? And what do those look like? What does that community entail? Who makes up that community? So just to start us off with some basics, some key features of community level prevention are going to include community organizing roots, right? When I say community organizing roots, I really mean going back to the roots of the domestic violence and sexual assault movement prior to, the movement and field going into nonprofits and becoming more mainstream. Much of the movement against domestic violence and sexual assault was grounded and based within community organizing of Black and Brown, queer and trans communities, right? That were working to keep each other safe. Going back to those roots of having that really strong community organizing foundation is really, really important within community level prevention, specifically because it really feeds into that community mobilization and engagement piece, right? We need folks from the community that we're working with to be heavily involved in the prevention effort that we are working to implement. We're going to talk about that a lot more in just a minute. But also, community level prevention is something that's going to usually move beyond skills building. There's definitely going to be some skills building in there. But a lot of it is going to be focused on addressing those community norms, addressing those community conditions that allow violence to take place, right? Again, a part of that is going to involve skills building. We want folks to have skills to engage in healthy conflict resolution. We want folks to have skills to be able to engage in trauma-informed practices, right? We want folks to have the skills to be safe and healthy, happy community members. And we also know that the overall environment itself is something that also needs to be addressed. It's not just on individuals changing their behavior, it's also on creating an environment that supports those healthy, positive community norms, right? So these are kind of 4 overarching kind of general key features when we talk about community level prevention. And it's also kind of helpful, I think, to organize our thinking in a way that kind of provides some distinctions between individual and relationship level and community level as well. So at the individual and relationship level, those levels really work to address attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that normalize violence, right? And it's primarily going to impact our personal views on healthy versus unhealthy behaviors, which is in turn going to impact how we treat others, right? A lot of that is done through skills-based learning, right? A lot of it is done through giving folks the skills, support, and resources to engage in conversations around boundaries and consent, to engage in conflict resolution skills, to engage in being able to have tough conversations with your partner or your loved one, right? But what we also know is that the reach can be limited to who has access to our programming, right? We do know that ideally there's going to be a bit of a ripple effect. So if we have a youth participating in a individual and relationship level healthy relationship program, prevention program, ideally the impact will ripple out to the people that that youth immediately interact with, right? That youth's peers, their friends, their partners, their family, right? So we do know that it's not just limited to who is in the program, but we do know that it is limited to who is able to get into our program, right? And many of us experience wait lists, or the demand is surpassing what we can provide, right? This is where community level prevention comes in. And I'm going to touch on the bottom point first. And that is that in community level prevention, the reach is usually going to go beyond who has access to or is involved in our programming. And that's because we're impacting the whole environment, right? Community level prevention is also social change based, as opposed to just focusing on skills based work. The social change component is we are changing the environment. We are changing the culture, changing the norms within this community, right? As opposed to just, I'm focusing on changing my behaviors and my attitudes and my beliefs. So that's where that scaling up comes in, because again, there will be an element of skills-based changing and adapting and growing of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, but the community level really builds on that and works to, again, address the environment, which is the next point. It seeks to change the environments and conditions in which our communities operate, and it also works to address the larger held norms and practices within a community. So that's where there's those kind of key differences. But I bet you can also kind of see how community level prevention can really just scale up the work that's already being done at the individual and relationship level. So some important considerations to make when doing community level prevention. A holistic, intersectional, and anti-oppression approach is absolutely key here. And that's again, because we know that the root causes of violence are systems of oppression. And we also know that those systems are interacting, right? We know that violence does not happen in a vacuum. We know that there's a lot of factors that contribute to a normalization of violence. And that means that our approach has to be holistic. It has to really recognize intersectionality. And it also has to really center an anti-oppression approach. Otherwise, we run the risk of potentially causing harm inadvertently if we aren't mindful of really ensuring that the work that we're doing is seeking to dismantle these systems. Community level prevention should also build or strengthen community capacity for responding to and preventing violence, right? We ideally want our communities to all feel equipped in knowing how they best need to respond to conflict or violence within their community, right? That relies less on systems, right? That community connection piece, I think, is really important here as well, because if a community feels connected, they're going to feel better equipped to handle difficult situations as they come up, right? And that's the goal. That's one of the biggest goals within this, because we also already know that for many communities, they've been figuring out how to respond to and prevent violence for generations, right? That's not something that we're necessarily going to walk in and say, here's what you need to do in order to keep your community safe, right? We're largely going to be listening to them and what they need, but our goal is to help build and strengthen that capacity. Community readiness and involvement is really key here, and we're going to spend more time talking about this in a moment, but we need to ensure that the community that we're working with is prepared, right? Is in a place where they have capacity to take on these projects, right? But their involvement in terms of deciding what it's going to look like, what is the project going to entail, right? What does success look like? Is largely going to be determined by the community members themselves, not necessarily you, the preventionist. So we also really want community level prevention to work to break down isolation and build community connectedness, right? We know that isolation can be a big risk factor for experiencing or perpetrating harm and violence. And we also know that community connectedness is a protective factor against violence. And ideally, again, that piece of really involving community members within the project itself is inherently going to build that community connectedness and break down that isolation and create further opportunities for that connection down the road. The people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. This is imperative, right? We as preventionists have a lot of technical knowledge and technical skills related to the prevention of violence. But if we especially are not necessarily a member of the community that we're going to be working with, this is where we take a back seat and really listen to what these community members have to say and prioritize their ideas and figure out a way to help support them in what they would like to see. But it is crucial to always remember that the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. Communities know what works and what doesn't work, and we need to listen to them. And then finally, built-in sustainability practices are really important here. So thinking through what partnerships could you explore in order to keep this going, and what resources are you going to need? And how can you pool those resources within those partnerships? So intentional community level prevention is usually, if not always, going to involve individual and relationship level components and characteristics. I say this because it can be easy to get a little overwhelmed when it comes to focusing on, I need to do community level prevention, and feeling like you need to abandon or get rid of the individual and relationship level components. And that's simply not true. And this is why, again, I've kind of framed this from the perspective of ways that you can scale up your individual and relationship level prevention to meet the community level, right? I really don't want folks to feel like you need to abandon the work that you're already doing. And we're going to talk about some examples of how to scale things up. But even if you come up with something brand new, a brand new program that's right out the gate community level, as I mentioned before, there's going to be those individual and relationship level components, right? You are building a relationship with the people that are involved in the project. And throughout the project, they themselves are going to be going through their own process of examining their attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, and probably changing those, right? Which also means that they're going to be changing their relationships with some folks, the relationship dynamics they have with folks. Those are all things that we want, and they're all individual and relationship level things that are still going to be taking place within a community level project. But it really does warrant an entire slide and bit of this presentation to really emphasize that community level prevention is not the removal or replacement of individual and relationship level. It's the scaling up of it. So here's an example, right? We have individual and relationship level. And an example of that is a multi-session healthy relationship curriculum for middle school youth, right? A way to scale that up to the community level would be also working with school admin to expand the reach of the healthy relationship curriculum, while also working to improve school climate, policies, and practices. So maybe it's you're working with school admin to ensure that you get access to all the health classes, right? So that your reach grows exponentially with the number of youth that have access to your individual and relationship level prevention programming. That in and of itself shows a large amount of prioritization within the school admin for this type of programming, which is going to impact the climate and the culture, right? But then also having a dedicated team, maybe a committee that is tasked with looking at ways to improve school climate policies and practices, and that ideally that would include faculty, staff, admin, and most importantly, youth, right? So that's a way that you can take an already really important and intentional and beneficial individual and relationship level program and scale it up to have the reach of that program go beyond just the youth that are involved in the individual and relationship level programming. One quick point that I do need to make is that there will never be a one-size-fits-all for community level prevention work because every community is different, right? What's going to work in one community might not work in another. What's relevant for one community might not be relevant in another, right? You might even have similar approaches or programming, but the way that it's implemented is going to be different. And so when I do share some of these ideas, some of them are going to resonate, some of them might not, and that's okay. If you're in the process of trying to figure out ways to level up to community level prevention, reach out. My email and my coworker, Borgia Ryan's email is going to be at the end of this presentation, and we encourage you to reach out to us, especially as you're brainstorming for new programming. We're here to help. That's what we're here for. So we're going to start moving into kind of the steps in general that are involved with community level prevention. We start out at community outreach and engagement. That's generally going to be the first step within prevention work, regardless of the level that you're trying to address. But that's where we start out. From there, we move into community readiness and a needs assessment. From there, we move into community mobilization, and then we move into the actual community level prevention work. So first and foremost, community engagement. Again, I mentioned that this is something that preventionists are doing regardless of the program, regardless of the level, right? Because we can't do prevention work unless we're going out in the community and engaging with them, right? I want to share this quote from Lydia Guy Ortiz because I think it really encapsulates why doing community level or community engagement rather is so important. And Lydia says, in partnership with others, we enter into a collaborative process to understand the dynamics of sexual violence in our communities and reduce the negative impact. Through dialogue and discourse, we reach a shared understanding. the resulting strategies derived from the collective mind are generally not what any individual stakeholder envisioned, but are quite often exactly what the community needs. I think that this perfectly summarizes how important it is to engage as much as we can within our communities when we're doing prevention work. It can be really easy for us to get kind of caught up in, again, our knowledge and expertise, right? We are in these positions for a reason. We have a lot of the technical skills and know-how. However, again, that resulting strategy derived from the collective mind are generally not what we might have had in mind, right? But are often exactly what that community needs, right? A lot of this involves a lot of humility, right? Approaching a community that we want to work with and understanding that we might have some ideas, but we're nowhere near as informed as they are, right? So that engagement piece is really important. And this is where I kind of want folks to pause and think about, what communities are you currently connected to? What communities are you currently working with? And what does that relationship look like? What are you currently working on with them? And I would imagine as you're thinking through this, there are some communities that you have a very strong relationship with. Maybe you've collaborated before, you've worked together before. Maybe there's somewhere in the middle. And then maybe there's a community where you kind of know each other, but you haven't really built an intentional relationship yet. Make note of those things. These are the things that would be helpful for folks to be kind of thinking about throughout this presentation. So that way, by the end of it, you'll have a bit more of a game plan for who you can go to, who you can reach out to, and what your goal is with those communities. Maybe you have one where you're like, I'm confident that a needs assessment would show that they're ready to go. And then maybe you have another community where you're like, we're nowhere near that yet. I need to work on just building a relationship. And that's okay. So community engagement, it really just involves intentional relationship building. So it's focused less on going into communities and telling them what they should do, and focus more on working alongside communities and developing a community-based plan of action. So community members are not just partners within, community members are partners within prevention work. They're not just participants, right? They're not just showing up for, a multi-session curriculum. They are standing alongside us as we are planning and implementing what our prevention program is going to look like. So this is where community readiness and needs assessment comes in. So the intention is to determine how a community views or thinks about interpersonal violence. It's also used to determine how important of an issue it is to them, or if there are maybe more pressing issues that they want to throw their capacity towards, and that's okay. It also helps to determine strengths within that community as well as needs within that community. And it also helps to gain insight and perspective from community members as well. This is an incredibly rich information gathering process. And even if by the end of it, it's determined that they don't have the capacity or maybe even desire to focus on this thing right now, this is still a really good tool when it comes to building an intentional relationship with a community that you want to work with. So here are some examples of some questions that you could ask during a community needs assessment. And you can do this in a wide variety of ways. It's all going to be based off of what's going to work best for that community. Some communities, they're going to have really quick, easy access to an online survey, and they can fill it out that way. Others, you're going to want to schedule probably at least a handful of in-person focus groups. Other communities, you might need to work with folks one-on-one, schedule a meetup to get some coffee, meet up with someone after work. Whatever is going to best fit the needs of that community is ideally what you're going to do. But some example questions that you can include on a readiness or needs assessment are, what are the needs of this community? What are the barriers that this community is currently experiencing? What will this community need in order to feel supported in these prevention efforts? What other communities is this community connected to? What's important to this community? Does this community feel like interpersonal violence is a problem within their communities? Or are there things that they're more concerned about? How does this community think about consent and boundaries? And how does this community define dignity, respect, community connection, and safety? What do those things mean to that community? How do they define it? So I'll just go back here really quick. These are just some examples of questions that you can come up with. And you can even get the input of community members in creating your needs assessment. Ask them what they would like to talk about, what questions they would like to answer. But there's a lot of customization possibility here with a readiness or needs assessment. And this is, again, something that board and I can help provide support around, is the creation of a tailored, personalized community needs assessment. So a holistic approach, right? A holistic approach is going to be an ongoing theme within community level prevention. And that's largely because sometimes we're not always going to lead with talking about domestic or sexual violence, right? I think one thing that I've learned over the years is, for many of us working in the DV or SA field, we are very comfortable and it's very normal for us to talk about domestic and sexual violence. But that's not really a norm across a lot of communities. And in fact, a lot of communities don't want to talk about those things, particularly with someone they're just getting to know, right? It might be something that you have to build towards or work towards in order for that relationship to really holistically and intentionally build. And that's okay. And it's okay because many of the concerns of communities are connected to DV and SA, even if not super obviously, right? These are things like economic issues, white supremacy and systemic racism, trans and LGBTQ rights, access to safe and stable housing, wage equality, access to medical and mental health care, right? We know that all of these are connected to risk and protective factors for domestic and sexual violence, right? So we also know that if we have a community that is particularly concerned about any one of these issues or any other issues, chances are it's going to connect back to DV and SA. And it makes more sense to work on building that holistic and intentional relationship with this community by first focusing on what they want to focus on. And this is also a good opportunity to begin to really demonstrate how these issues are also connected to these ones, right? And how our approaches for any social issue should have that holistic approach so that it can address other things as well. So then we move into community mobilization, right? We've done our community engagement and outreach. We've identified a community that we want to work with. We've approached them. We've reached out to them. There's some initial buy-in. We do a community readiness or needs assessment, evaluate the results together. It looks like this community is ready to go. They're excited. They have capacity and energy towards it. Now we move into the mobilization piece. So some big considerations for community mobilization are going to be, and this is something that you're going to want to talk through with the community that you're working with. But first and foremost, what are you trying to address, right? This can largely be answered through the risk and protective factors that you want to focus on. Then you can ask who else needs to be involved, who's not at the table currently, who should. What will we need to begin our mobilization work? How do we go from planning to implementation? And what additional connections and resources will we need? I want to pause here, and I wanted to make sure that I threw in this chart of risk and protective factors at the community level, because this is where this conversation will be taking place. Is kind of with the community you're working with, identifying out of this kind of list. It's obviously not exhaustive, but there's a decent amount of stuff on here. But out of this, What do you want to focus on, right? So again, risk factors, these are things we want to address, and protective factors are the things that we want to uplift, right? That's the other important thing here as well. Making sure that when we are doing this work with communities, we're talking about these things in really plain language, right? So instead of risk factors, it's the things that you want to address or change, right? Protective factors are the things that are helpful, that we know are good. Those are the things that we want to uplift and encourage, right? But I'll pause here for just a moment so folks can either take a screenshot or just review this. This chart is also in the prevention toolkit, which I will also be sending out to folks as well. But just some examples, some risk factors at the community level are high rates of poverty and limited educational and economic opportunities, communities where neighbors don't know or look out for each other. There's low community involvement among residents. On the other side, the protective factors are things we want to uplift. We have neighborhood collective efficacy. So residents feel connected to each other and are involved in the community, coordination of resources among community agencies, access to resources like housing, mental and medical care, and access to economic and financial help, right? But I wanted to make sure I included this just to show some examples of those, things that you should be having conversations about with the community that you're working with in terms of what are you identifying as something you want to work on. So getting from point A to point B, with point A going from we want to prevent violence to this is how we're going to do that, right? So you want to develop an overarching goal or focus. You then want to develop risk and protective factors or community conditions to be addressed. You want to determine needs and strengths within the community you're working with. You then want to analyze the resources you presently have available, as well as any potential additional partners. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And then from there, you determine based off of risk and protective factors, strengths and needs, resources and partners, what steps are possible in working towards that overarching goal and focus. The quick point that I want to make about additional partners, this is where getting creative about who else maybe you're bringing in really becomes important. There's something called multi-sector partners. By sector, I mean the way that our society is kind of organized in terms of entities, right? So we have the education sector, right? We have schools, school districts. There's also healthcare is a sector. We have law enforcement as a sector. There's social services as a sector, the media, local businesses, labor unions. Multi-sector partnerships recognize that because the issues of domestic and sexual violence are so multifaceted, right? Our work will be best done with more partnerships, right? So this is in addition to the community that you've already identified that you're going to be working with. But maybe throughout the planning process, you and the community you're working with identify, it would be really great if we could partner with the local parks department and got them on board. Not just got them on board in terms of being able to host events at a park, but also got them involved in terms of maybe they have a representative that sits on our planning committee, right? Maybe they invite us in to talk about the work that we're doing. Maybe they're interested in us providing them some support around ways that they can create a better work environment. That's just one example. And we're going to be sending out some more information and resources about multi-sector partners, but I just wanted to plant that seed as far as these are opportunities to be able to really bring in those other sectors that might not be overtly connected to domestic violence or sexual assault, but have a stake in the prevention of those things and have resources and perspectives to offer towards making our efforts as holistic as possible. So I also want to pause here as well and really invite folks to think about what communities you would like to begin engaging with and working alongside, right? And so that goes back to that first initial question of what communities are you already working with? And again, there might have been some communities on that list where you're like, I kind of am, but not so much. Those are great places to start, but maybe it's a community that you haven't worked with at all, but you know is a really important community within your larger service area, and you want to start building that relationship. Take note of that and really start thinking about what steps you can take to begin fostering and building that connection and relationship. So putting it all together, let's talk about what this actually looks like. So first and foremost, again, we start with community engagement. So you're going to identify the community you'd like to work alongside, and you're going to begin the outreach and relationship building. Part of that's going to involve supporting the work that they're doing, right? Find out what they're working on. Find out what they're concerned about. Find out what they're passionate about. Support them in that. From there, we move into community readiness. So this is where you'll begin asking stakeholders their perspectives on violence in their community, what strengths and barriers exist, and what would be necessary in order for their community to thrive, right? You're going to gauge interest and capacity for engaging in violence prevention community work. And again, this is where you're going to get creative with how you're going about having these conversations. One community might say, put it on a survey online, we'll fill it out. Give us a week. We're good. Another one, again, you might need to meet with folks one-on-one over the course of a month. And that's okay, right? You're meeting the community where they're at. From there, we move into the community mobilization steps, right? And this is where I would encourage folks to actually write these things out, either on flip chart paper, in a Word or Excel document, whatever is going to work best for you in the community you're working with. But this is where I would really ensure that you are putting pen to paper with these things. Because you're going to want to write out what is the defined community and who's involved, who are the stakeholders. From there, you're going to want to identify the conditions you want to address, those risk and protective factors. And then you're going to brainstorm. What are some potential prevention approaches or activities that you could do? And from there, how are you going to measure success? How will you know if you're succeeding in your efforts? So you have to come up with your indicators of change. How are you going to evaluate these efforts? And what will those evaluation efforts look like? And then you're going to end with power mapping. So this is where you're going through and listing out what resources you have, what partners you have, so you get a more accurate idea of what you're working with. So here we have an example of putting this into practice. So the defined community is a local neighborhood, right? For me, it would be the Mountain View neighborhood, right? So the stakeholders or people involved are people that are living in the neighborhood, as well as we've got some community resource providers on board too. And we've identified that we want to address a lack of community connection or places for people in the neighborhood to connect. And we also want to address lack of access to resources. So our idea for a potential prevention approach is to create ways for the community to connect and access more resources, right? How will we measure if that's successful? Well, we can start out really simple. As we're creating these events and avenues for people to connect, we count the number of people accessing our programming. We evaluate that over time. Is it increasing, decreasing? Why might that be? You could also do surveys at events, asking people in the community for their feedback. And then from there, the power mapping is maybe we look at wanting to bring in additional local resource providers, and also looking at partnering with the city or the county. And then bringing it all together, what we eventually come up with is either creating a family or neighborhood resource center as part of a community reinvestment project that we're partnering with the city on. that these neighborhood representatives are a part of, and that these community resource providers are a part of. Or you could clean up a local park to make it more welcoming and regularly host community fairs for resource access and community connection. That would also probably involve, the Parks Department, the city, as well as the community itself and these resource providers. This is a good example of that multi-sector partnership, right? Because it's not just the neighborhood, folks in the neighborhood that you're working with. It also is other social service providers, right? It's also the city, the county, the Parks Department. Those multi-sector partnerships really help to ensure the success of this programming. So some other examples that I have here, maybe you work collaboratively with a local library to offer violence prevention programming to the community while also training library staff on creating protective environments. This is actually something that YWCA Clark County down in Vancouver, Washington is working on. And I also want to note that the example from the previous slide is an idea from the prevention program director at YWCA Clark County in Vancouver, Tanika Cisco. You also could potentially work collaboratively with other local service providers to create wraparound services or more streamlined ways and holistic ways that folks can get connected to resources. You could implement coaching boys into men or athletes as leaders at a school while also working with that school's admin to update school policies and practices. You could collaborate with local labor unions to advocate for workers' rights related to paid leave, anti-sexual harassment policies, etc. You could also maybe collaborate with the local Department of Health to create programming that addresses health inequities. These are just a few examples, and some of these are going to work in one community and some of them won't work in another, right? These aren't meant to act as hard suggestions for folks to follow, and more so for inspiration, right? Again, no, there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all community level prevention approach. And again, this is where Ward and I can help you. If you're wanting to explore moving up to the community level in your prevention work, reach out to us and we can help brainstorm what that could look like. That is everything that we have today. I want to again reiterate, Ward and I are here to help in all of your prevention efforts, whether or not it's figuring out how to scale up your current programming, come up with something new, get help with evaluation, barriers that you're experiencing. We are your training and technical assistance providers, and we are here for you. I also know that there might be more questions that you have after this training, so please feel free to reach out. Let us know how we can help. We'll also be sending out some additional resources. Please also let us know what resources you'd like. We're in the process of figuring out creating new resources, and it would be really helpful to have folks share with us what you're looking for and what would be helpful. But once again, my name's Jessie, and I'm really, really glad that I was able to get this recorded for folks. Please let me know if you have any questions, and don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks, everybody.